Watch out on the right hand side, watch out.
We're squeezing right through one of these mangrove gardens. This seems like we're, a scene from one of the great adventure movies. I'm thinking of Teddy Roosevelt going down the Amazon River with his son.
My little finger dangling in the water. He keeps coming back. He leaves, but he keeps coming back and trying to bite it. I haven't let him get it yet. Keep my finger. But he's the most curious pufferfish I think I've ever seen. Jump, please.
We saw dozens of sea turtles, but only a few sharks. So one of our field producers, Peter, took things into his own hands. Literally.
What did you do to your finger?
Yeah, so we're looking for sharks. I sliced my finger and dripped blood in for a while, but it took a while, but then some big sharks showed up.
I said somebody should cut their finger and put some blood in the water. It was a joke. Yeah, I'm not going to say things like that anymore.
In the mangrove garden of the Galapagos, we see a world of diverse creatures. And one of the most interesting things we see here is that many of them have similar or homologous body parts. But why? Why do animals as different as the sea turtle and the dolphin both have flippers? The same could be said about penguins and seals. One is a bird and the other is a mammal, but they too have flippers. When dealing with morphology in Chapter 13 of Origin of Species, Darwin argued heavily that homology, the study of comparative anatomies, was conclusive evidence of common ancestry, but it could be better understood as the handiwork of a common designer. While on Jarvis Island, Dr. Tom Ford, PhD in biomechanics, described to us some of these amazing biological similarities between animals and even humans.
If it was from a human hip, you'd have much more of a round bony process here. It would fit into a socket like the hip does. But the shoulder has a process that's a little more flat. It looks like a golf ball sitting on a tee. So it gives you much more range of motion, but it's not as stable as a human hip. This end looks more like an elbow would. It's going to be a joint that only moves in flexion and extension, more than likely. This is going to be 3 dimensions. This right here looks like, on the human arm, you have what's called the bicipital groove, and it's the long head of the bicep, comes up and through the shoulder joint. So probably the muscle belly, it looks like, may fit in there, and a tendon's going to run through the joint.
Do similar body parts point to a common origin in an evolutionary tree of life? For Darwin, the answer was a resounding yes. Here again, this essential ingredient of Darwinian evolutionary theory has been discredited by the science of genetics. Modern genetics has shown that many homologous animals are completely unrelated. How is it possible that humans and giant squids have both developed eyeballs with so many similarities down to the retinas? Why do completely unrelated animals living in separate environments independently evolve remarkably similar characteristics? Evolutionists attempt to explain this phenomenon through a process known as convergent evolution. The idea here is that animals in unrelated lineages independently evolve similar traits. In other words, birds, bats, bugs, and reptiles that fly were directed by a non-intelligent process to the same conclusion: wings. British paleontologist Simon Conway Morris says there is an optimum body plan. which life will inevitably evolve towards, with evolution bound to stumble upon intelligence. But the very idea of natural selection having an evolutionary goal implies intelligence, and this goes against the entire basis of the model. The evolutionist sees these similar traits as proof of common ancestry or a common evolutionary goal, but we see them as proof of a common designer, and we believe that Jesus Christ is that exceedingly wise designer.
Darwin made his argument from homology and morphology, essentially looking to comparative anatomical structures and the way they change. Well, this argument has been utterly blown out of the water. The idea was this: well, look at a gorilla. It seems to have arms like you, seems to have a head like you. Doesn't that show that you come from some sort of a common ancestor? The same things were done with other animals. In fact, today evolutionists will tell you that whales came from a pig-type creature that existed before the whales. Why? Well, because they're mammals, and so mammals started on the land. So the fish came onto land, and the land went back into the water, and they became whales. And a lot of the things they're looking at are morphology and homology. They're looking at comparative anatomical structures. This argument is a complete loser argument. And it's a loser argument because genetics is proving to us that this is completely false. There are similarities of design structure found within the world that God has created. What does it really prove? A common designer. It's a common designer. We have a common designer that has built in certain infrastructural design components into all of the different animals. Evolutionists will say, well, we're this percentage related, but guess what? We're almost that closely related genetically to a banana as well. So it's far more complicated than the evolutionists are willing to tell us. The third one was intermediate forms that we'd find in the fossil record. And Darwin said, you know what, we don't have them yet. But they're coming. We're going to find them. You mark my word, within 100 years, we're going to find these transitional forms in the fossil record. John, have you seen any transitional forms lately in the fossil record?
I've been studying a lot about fossils here lately. I'm writing a book on fossils.
I think we're still waiting.
There's just no transitional forms. I mean, there are the same categories that are alive today. These kinds that we see today, the dogs and the cats. And, well, we see extinct cats and we see extinct dogs, but they're dogs and cats.
So the fossil record is constantly emphasizing to us, again, God created kinds, and there's a lot of different variation within those kinds, but there's nothing in between the kinds. There's not a half cat, half dog. So here are Darwin's big arguments, and all of them are rejected today. They're all false. Therefore, why do evolutionists continue to believe in evolution? Well, Stephen Jay Gould and others have pointed out in the past that the alternative is impossible. They simply could not accept a Christian worldview. So they have to accept by faith a system, even though they don't have the foundations to prove the basic assumptions. They accept their assumptions by faith, even as we accept our assumptions by faith, namely that the Bible is true and God is sovereign.
Doug surprised me. I learned that he hadn't always been such an avowed creationist, and that he owed his change of mind to a book written by Dr. John's father, Dr. Henry Morris, the founder of the modern creation movement.
Both his book and Dr. John's father, Dr. Henry Morris, had a profound impact on me. I was just a completely excited young evolutionist unbeliever when I was a boy. Because I went to government schools where I was taught evolution. I watched PBS. Boy, PBS, I love those documentaries about evolution. I ate them up. But then I read this book. I read the Bible and I read the Genesis flood. And those books, first the Word of God got into my heart, and then when I read the Genesis flood, everything made sense. And I went from being a very committed evolutionist to being a budding young creationist with a passion for this. And at that time I hoped and prayed that the Lord would allow me to someday do the very things we're doing here.
When we look at these strange and unusual formations, it seems we're staring into the ancient past. But the reality is, each of these islands is relatively young, birthed violently out of the ocean in a rush of fire and lava.
For the evolutionists, the answer to some of these glaring issues is the idea that the Earth is billions of years old, and just about anything is possible in that amount of time. George Walden, in his book, The Origins of Life, says, "Time is in fact the hero of the plot." Given so much time, the impossible becomes possible, the possible probable, and the probable virtually certain. One has only to wait. Time itself performs miracles. But can the Earth really be as old as the evolutionists claim?
Doug, you see that the two different kinds of rock there toward the water, and around over here you see this is the lava that was extruded from that volcano within the last 100 years or so, and it covered this whole area. But the layering above that is quite interesting to me. It's very thinly bedded, and the closer you get, you still see these thin, fine little beds. That is due to an explosive eruption. The volcano was what it was. The lava flow rolled out of the crater and then came down this way. But this explosive eruption just boom went up, and then as it came back down, it went probably out as a pyroclastic flow, it's called. And as it came down, it just shot out in this direction, probably in all directions, and laying down one after the other within seconds, one layer after another, these laminae. Now, you know, when I was a geology student, when I was in graduate school, I was taught that whenever you see these fine little gradations like this, that these are formed, they say, in a lake environment or maybe a lagoon, something like that. And it's seasonal deposition. In the winter, there'll be a little bit, just less than a millimeter, and then in the summer, there'll be less than a millimeter. And so whenever you see this layer, a winter-summer couplet, that represents a year. And if you went over here to this cliff, you'd see millions of those layers. So obviously, it took millions and millions of years. No, it didn't. It probably took 4 hours or 2 hours. I mean, it just happened right now. Just boom, boom, boom. With a catastrophe, things can happen in a hurry. Things that we are taught to assign great ages to can happen in a hurry. This reminds me of Mount St. Helens. I've studied Mount St. Helens up in the state of Washington for some time, and Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980. Of course, it's erupted numerous times, but the big eruption was in 1980. And the lava dome, the solid lava dome that plugged up the vent, that rock has been dated with radioisotope dating. Now, it erupted in 1980. The theory is of radioisotope dating that when it's in liquid form, the magma, it resets the clock at zero. So if you were to date a rock formed when it was recently liquid, then it should basically date
an accurate time.
Too young to measure. But you know how old that lava at Mount St. Helens dates?
No, how old?
It dates at 2.4 million years.
Okay, so this raises a pretty fundamental question about radioisotopic dating.
We saw it happen, you know, in 1980, in fact, there have been many of the recent volcanoes that have gone off, from Vesuvius to Krakatoa to Pompeii to just name them. They've all been dated. And every one of those recent volcanoes has dated millions and millions of years
What's
old.
the problem? Is this a faulty dating method?
I think the method is wrong. The measurements are precise. The equations are correct. Everything about it is right. But the theory, it's based on the assumptions behind the theory. I think those are wrong.
Darwin has often been presented as an open-minded Christian, an unbiased naturalist in search of answers when he came to Galapagos. But by the time he arrived here, his opinion was firmly set on